This unit is all about the contexts for development, and we mean it in two ways. One are the cultural contexts in which people grow up and develop by country and subcultures within countries. The other is context over your lifetime. So the differences between when you're young and what are the contexts around that and when you become older. So this PowerPoint goes over chapter 4, and then I'll go over chapter 5. So here we're talking about the role of culture in developing strengths and living well. When we talk about culture in psychology, we think culture counts in the etiology or the source of problems that people have. And we need to incorporate cultural issues better. In other words, we might say that someone's not functioning well and we pathologize an aspect of someone's culture when in fact they are functioning quite well according to their culture. Positive psychology needs to better address these cultural contexts, and we want to view it in a very broad sense. In other words, we want to think about those big strokes that have differences in terms of culture and cultural values. Part of the challenge has been that psychology has taken a genetically deficient perspective at times. In other words, looking at people from different cultures, and even Galton measured brain sizes early on to say, well, there's some biological bases for deficiencies, and we now know that that perspective is completely wrong. There continues to be a strong belief in genetic superiority, in particular for white Caucasians or intellectually superior, when in fact there's no evidence for that. And pseudoscience and eugenics. So this refers to people's feelings about, well, it's so and so said this, or it sounds like it could be true, but it hasn't been empirically verified. Eugenics is this idea that we want to only have the strong, genetically strong, have children. And again, that's a problematic approach. When we think about this culturally deficient perspective, it's quite at odds with how positive psychology thinks about strengths in every culture. And environmental factors can influence growth. So, changes in the environment, access to resources can affect a person's psychological strengths. You might also lack exposure to a prevailing culture. We see that in the United States. We have some strong subcultures, and um, they may look different than us, the majority culture. And again, this is what we would say is not a strength-based view. So what we want to think about is a culturally different perspective, culturally pluralistic, recognizing that there's more than one way to think about strengths, and culturally relativistic, meaning that it is relative to that particular culture, strengths, and values. When we think about culturally embedded positive psychology, there are some culture sensitive recommendations, and the book discusses that, and that some strengths are perhaps universal, but there might be a difference in how these positive traits are manifested. Take just the emotion of happiness. Americans tend to smile a lot. We're very sort of an extroverted people, even if we're introverts. Whereas in other countries, as you'll learn about in this unit, they don't smile all the time, and they are not looking to engage total strangers. And we might think of them as rude or not being welcoming, but in fact, it's just a different way, manifestation, that these positive traits are exhibited. When we think about happiness in Eastern and Western cultures, there's difference in how that is conceptualized and experienced by people. Life satisfaction is another example. We tend in the United States to think more about, at least when we're younger, our materialistic goods as a way to think about how happy we are. As we get older, as you know, our relationships seem to matter more. And there's a cultural environment that guides our values. Just look at television, is very different here than in other parts of the world. So culture is everywhere, and it's difficult to see your own culture because you're so embedded in it and a product of it. Another of the challenges, as we've talked about before, is equivalence. So when we do cross-cultural or multicultural research, cross-cultural would be in another country, multicultural would be several sites in different countries. figuring out what, if we're going to do a survey, what is the equivalent word to happiness or joy or thriving is challenging. And we want to draw on both quantitative studies, meaning we're measuring that numerically, objectively as possible, and also qualitative studies where we're asking people about their experiences. So as we work to figure out what does courage look like? Is it the same? Is it thought about the same in different countries or different cultures? Optimism and pessimism studies are another example where researchers have tried to do this work, and they have found that cultural facets can provide some strengths. And there's also differences and benefits from coping strategies. So people from certain cultures benefit from certain strategies more than others. When we think about what are the foundations of the good life, this is really our interest. We want to think about how culture influences our views of the good life. What does it mean to live well? And experiences help form our worldviews. The book talked about the wise man of the Gulf. As you may remember, the tourist goes down and he sees the fisherman with a boat, and he is fishing and he's very successful. But the guy says, "Hey, if you got up a little earlier and you bought some more boats, you could make more money." And the guy keeps going, and then what would happen? And then what would happen? And you kind of get to the end of the story, and the tourist is saying, "Well, if you do all this stuff, then you can save up with this money and retire and spend time with your family." And the wise guy's going, "Well, I get to spend time with my family now. That's what I value now." So again, it's a great example of how people tend to apply their worldview to others in terms of what makes people happy. We also want to take some caution in measuring universal strengths, again, because of this equivalence problem. Traits and characteristics might be defined differently. How we might, as Americans, define bravery might be different in other cultures. And even similarities sometimes are not what they appear to be. So we want to be aware of biases as both practitioners and consumers, or if you have clients, when we're thinking about what universal strengths are like. Do think of multicultural mindset as a strength, and we have a way to measure this with the multicultural personality questionnaire. There's 5 factors, and it assesses your comfort operating in different cultures. I know the first time I traveled somewhere that was different from where I was from, it's a challenge, and to understand that difference doesn't mean deficit. It can mean strengths, and trying to appreciate and understand those is really what positive psychology in a cultural context is all about. When we talk about some final thoughts, we want to continue to study cultural influences and examine strengths, particularly of marginalized groups. There's a lack of non-Western research in this area. Most of research in psychology is Western, United States and Europe. But what about perspectives of people from, we have an entire continent of Africa and a lot of countries there and a lot of cultural differences. Even in the United States, what is happiness, say, on Native American different tribes? And the tribes are also different in terms of what strengths and positive psychology, life well lived, looks like. So keep thinking about what is it about your own culture and how might it be different in terms of flourishing in another culture. Chapter 5 then talks about living well at every stage of life. So how can we think about these contexts across our lives? And when we think about living well, part of what we want to think about is youth. So when we look at positive youth development as opposed to sort of average or not being very successful, there's been a lot of work with resilience. So if you encounter difficulty and challenges, what makes you resilient or able to bounce back, have a positive adaptation to significant adversity? Maybe there's a hurricane, death of a family member, war. There could be a number of adverse traumatic events, and how can youth bounce back from that? There's two dimensions the book talks about and 4 potential experiences, so you should be familiar with those. Make sure you take a look at that as we think about resilience. Was bounce back to what? And again, there are cultural differences in how we might conceptualize that. And external meaning outside of us. So what is it in terms of maybe faith organizations or family members, extended family members, a trusted adult who could help us, schooling. So what are those structures that are external to us that can help us to adapt? And internally, what are our internal resources in terms of strengths that might help us bounce back? A classic study the book talks about in detail is the Kauai. The roots of resilience research comes out of this study. The children in this study in Kauai, which is an island in Hawaii, were at risk. And over 80% of them bounced back later in life. And this was attributed to having at least one supportive adult in the child's life. When we look at resilience resources, we know that there are strong, potent, protective factors in development, and culture also influences our ability to cope with adversity. There's thousands of development programs, and when we think about positive youth development, it's an ongoing process. There are at least 9 positive outcomes, and work is continuing in this area as we think about how to provide positive adults in youth lives. Positive youth development can be designed for specific groups. It may not always be equally accessible. And we're trying to move away from studying the negative, like what's wrong with these children or what's wrong with their environment, and instead looking at what's right. And how we can look at that is to focus on civic behaviors, um, focus on how we can help young people, especially if they're facing adversity, but they're doing well, they're thriving, and they have a spark. We know that strong relationships are very impactful, and a lot of programs, such as Big Brothers and Big Sisters, are designed to provide a mentor or an adult figure. The Penn Resiliency Program does it as well, as does the Changing Lives program. So there's a number of programs that try to provide what we know is important to help build resiliency for youth. We also have several studies out of developmental psychology that have followed people throughout their life. The Terman longitudinal study of gifted children is one of these. It started with over 1,000 children, and they were selected based on their IQ. I actually, when I first went to graduate school, studied with someone who was trying to replicate some of the findings with teenagers in this study, so I'm quite familiar with Terman's work. And the finding is that IQ does not guarantee success. It's certainly related to success, but that alone, being smart, isn't enough to make a life well lived, and it doesn't protect against poor decisions. Valiant is another person who also studied, in this case, Harvard young men who were doing very well. They were at Harvard University. He built on Terman's work and redefined 6 tasks of adult development. So as we're adults, we need to master these tasks successfully to be able to have a life well lived. And some of this work also comes out of Erik Erikson's developmental theory when we think about the successful resolutions to these challenges. So what is successful aging? The MacArthur study looked at this, and they found several distinct themes in the Carr and Weir study. There are some room for cultural interpretations in these themes. And when we think about successful aging, life engagement, and again, think of PERMA. So engagement is one of those main concepts with PERMA, is really relevant to positive psychology. That socio-emotional and instrumental support that we get from other people, so those positive relationships, and productivity even in late adulthood, so this idea of accomplishment. So these ideas might look very different as we age, but they're also quite important as we think about what are some universals in positive development. Valiant identified some very specific lifestyle factors with the happy well and the sad sick. So your mood seems to also be related to how well you're doing. And these positive emotional experiences, so that's the P in PERMA, in early life also seem to protect us in some way against life's challenges and buffers us against life's difficulties, including things like a global pandemic. So thinking about how we can foster positive emotional experiences in early life can make a difference later in life. I hope this review of the main concepts in these chapters has helped you think about cultural differences across countries and people and subcultures, but also context matter in terms of across our life, what makes us